You're tuned in to Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick. This is episode 129, Jubilee and Pilgrimage, with Dr. Jim Papandrea. Before we get into tonight's episode, guys, just a word about my sponsor, Havana Palace on Huron Church Road in Windsor, Ontario, for the best service and finest cigars. Go see Caesar and Eli. They treat all their customers like family. If you would be so kind as to go to facebook.com/Havana Palace, give that page a like. I would greatly appreciate that. All right, so we have Dr. Jim Papandrea back on the show for, I don't know, probably the 10th time now.
I don't know, but it's always great to be here.
Returning guest and good friend. Before we dive into tonight's topic, just wanted to check in with you, Jim, see how you're doing. If you have any new projects in the works or anything just recently released, what do you got going on?
Well, I'm actually kind of in between projects right now, ready to start a couple new things. But the thing I'm just finishing up actually, and it's on topic because I have a guide to Rome. It's called Rome, a Pilgrim's Guide to the Eternal City, and I just finished doing a complete revision of that book. So the second edition is coming out. It's not out yet, but it's coming out, and got to update everything. The new version has color pictures instead of the black and white versions that were in the old one. Um, it's got journaling pages that weren't there before. It's got some more advice on how to prioritize your time in Rome. And I broke with my own tradition, breaking my own rules here, and I'm giving away the secret to. I'm telling my two favorite restaurants in Rome. So
Okay.
so I'm giving that up, but it's not out yet, and it's in final editing right now because I had this flood in our house last summer. It all put me behind, so it's supposed to be out
Right.
by now. But that's kind of the big thing that's coming out soon, I hope. Yeah.
And who's the publisher?
That is Cascade Books, they're called. Yeah, the original version of this book was actually one of the first books I ever published. Like,
Oh, wow.
yeah, decades ago now. So it's really, I'm really happy to be able to update it based on a lot more years of actually going to Rome and leading tours there, and this will be the first year, apart from COVID, this will be the first year in a long time that I'm not leading a pilgrimage to Rome this year. But we can talk about that later about where we are going this year. But as you know, it's a Jubilee year, and so people are invited to come home to Rome.
Fantastic. Well, it's a good place to be, as always. Very grateful for our Catholic faith, and it's a special year this year. Just a segue into the topic for tonight. So it's a Jubilee year. Now, I have to be honest with you, Jim. I know a few things about Catholicism, but one of the things I'm not really up on, so to say, is the concept of the Jubilee year and the holy doors and all of that. So, can you please enlighten us? What is going on here? What is this Jubilee year all about? What has this been historically? How does it maybe tie into Scripture? I know
Yeah,
there's a Jubilee year in the book of Leviticus, so we can
right.
maybe talk about that. But yeah, just give us like a little rundown. What's this all about? What's the history here going on?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to do that, and we're going to eventually come up to a question I'm hoping you can help me answer. But it all goes back to this concept of the Jubilee in the Old Testament, and you see that in Deuteronomy 15 and Leviticus. I'm pretending not to looking at my notes here, but I actually am looking at my notes. Leviticus 25. And back in the Old Testament, there was this creation of this Jubilee year, which was um, a year for the forgiveness of debts, for the release of prisoners and slaves. Um, and eventually, I think it also kind of took on a bit of a return from exile vibe. But for the most part, it was a year of renewal, and even back then, well, I mean, God knew that it's better for the land if if you're growing crops, every once in a while you don't grow crops. I'm not a farmer, so I don't know the physics or the science of this, but apparently you let the land go for a while, for a year, and you don't grow anything. It lets the land, even the land replenishes itself. And so it's this kind of idea of a fresh start, a renewal. Um, like I said, the forgiveness of debt, which, as you know, in the New Testament, St. Paul often talks about sin in terms of debt. And so, this idea of forgiveness, um, and freedom from slavery, even. And again, St. Paul in the New Testament talks about sin as a form of slavery. And so, this sort of release from various forms of captivity. And that concept gets translated into the church, um, and added to it, by the way, a kind of an element from the story of the prodigal son, of returning home, the prodigal returning home. And so what you get is this tradition within the church of this idea of returning home, but actually by going to a special place that's not your home. So it's a little bit of a reversal, which we can definitely talk about. But here's where I was hoping you could help me, because I think you've done a little bit more study on some of the Jewish background of the church than I have. The word Jubilee comes from the name for a ram's horn that was blown at certain times of celebration, called a jobel. And so Jubilee, or jubilation, is the blowing of the jobel, right? That's where it comes from. But here's what I don't know. I don't know the difference between a jobel and a shofar. Are you up on that at all?
Well, you kind of stole where I was going with that. I was going to ask you, like, isn't that the shofar? I've never actually heard of the Jobel. So
No.
I thought they were one and the same thing. I guess not.
Well, I could be wrong,
Or
and
they
somebody,
might be. Might be
if
just a
someone's
different
out
term.
there, if someone's out there who knows better than I do, but I think they're two different things for two different kinds of occasions within, like, the Hebrew liturgy and celebrations. Um,
Right.
but
The
but I
shofar would be the Day of Atonement.
Right. So that has a different function than the Jobel, which is for celebration. But again,
Interesting.
I'm gonna say up front, I could be wrong about that. Um, so if anybody knows, post it in the chat. By the way, I saw a couple nice comments in the chat. Thank you for your support out there. So yeah, that's kind of the background of the idea of the Jubilee. But then in the church, it becomes connected to the idea of pilgrimage. And pilgrimage really, um, it's actually, I know other religions have pilgrimages too.
Hmm.
Um, but Christianity is kind of unique in the sense that the idea of pilgrimage is based on this concept of holy ground, right? But not simply, oh, this place is holy because something important happened here, although that could be part of it. But holy ground in the sense of a kind of, like Celtic theology, they calls it the thin places, the places where the veil between this world and next is thinnest. And why is that? It's because it all goes back to the doctrine of the resurrection. And don't want to go too far off on a tangent here, but the Christian doctrine of the resurrection says that, our bodies are essential parts of who we are, and when we die, um, our bodies and our spirits are separated, but only temporarily. And that is not meant to be a permanent um, circumstance. In other words, we don't think of the afterlife as a completely disembodied existence. And for that time when our bodies and spirits are separated, we're sort of in tension, um, waiting to be reunited in the resurrection. So, and I think it was Saint Macrina one of the mothers of our church, who said that the whole time your body and spirit are separate, your spirit watches over even all the little bits of your body until they come back together in the resurrection, and your body and spirit are reunited. And the reason why that's important is because the place where the bodily remains of a saint or martyr rest is holy ground, because those bodily remains are still connected in a mystical way to their spirit, which is in paradise with Christ. And so, from the very beginning of our faith, Christians have always visited the tombs of the martyrs and other saints because of their relics. Their remains are there, and that makes the place holy ground. And the most important place, the most important tomb, has always been the tomb of St. Peter. I mean, obviously, the tomb of Jesus would be important too, but there's no relics there, right? So,
Right.
the place to visit um, was always Peter's tomb, and so what we get is this combination of the idea of Jubilee as renewal and freedom, with this idea of pilgrimage as a way of visiting a holy site, where you would ask the saint in question for their intercession, and you would, feel closer to God because you're closer to the saint's relics, and the saint's spirit is with God. And so this idea of pilgrimage then, well, it's just always been a part of our faith. Um, and so these ideas get combined then in the Middle Ages. And so with the creation of the Christian Jubilee, um, the the idea is you're being invited to return home to the church spiritually and physically, literally, and go to Rome and visit the holy sites there, especially the tomb of Peter, and in that way, it's a it's a penance. It's a penance, because what you have to remember is, in the Middle Ages, it was not a vacation to go on pilgrimage; it was a hardship. Many people spent their entire life savings. Many people were gone from home for months or a year or years at a time, and many people died along the way, either on the way there or on the way back, and never came home. So it was a huge hardship, which meant that it was a penance, and so it becomes a way of doing penance as well, and coming back to the faith, or reorienting yourself toward God. There's a whole bunch of words that you could apply to pilgrimage. It's like a reboot of your faith, or a recommitment, or um, almost like a retreat, but exponentially more than a retreat. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I hadn't thought of a pilgrimage in terms of a form of penance before, but I mean, it makes sense. I did recall seeing something about, I think it's something to do with St. Patrick. People will go to this certain place in Ireland, and it was really arduous, to be able to, do all the circuits and all the stations, but it was like a severe form of penance.
Yeah.
So that's still a thing today. I didn't really think of that, though, historically, that would be the case.
Yeah, that's
What
right.
when would you say, so I mean, this is obviously rooted in our faith, like you say, from its inception, but like, when did the Jubilee year, when did that concept actually like become cemented in the church, so that it was something that we observed? Like, how far back
Yeah.
does that go?
Well, the earliest precedents for it are in the 13th century, the 1200s. So one of the first that I know of, although to your point, I'm sure people were making pilgrimages to, St. Patrick's places, and obviously, we know from the church fathers that people were making pilgrimages to Peter's tomb from day one. But
Right.
one of the earliest, like sort of papal pronouncements that comes up as a precursor to this is actually um, in the year 1216. The Pope at the time said anyone going to visit the sites of Saint Francis in Assisi, so anyone making a pilgrimage to Assisi, and specifically cross the threshold of the Portiuncula, the little portion church there, um, would receive an indulgence. And then we see in 1222 the Santiago de Compostela, um, that starts about that time. In the 1280s, people were invited specifically to visit St. Peter's tomb, but it was really in the year 1300. It was Pope Boniface the Eighth. Again, I'm pretending not to look at my notes, even though I am. Pope Pope Boniface the Eighth in the year 1300 officially pronounced the first, you know, Jubilee year for the church, and it's really interesting. At the beginning, the idea was you'd make a pilgrimage to Rome, and you would you would be expected to enter the basilicas of St. Peter's and St. Paul's. Now remember, this is the old St. Peter's, right, before they built the present one.
Right.
Um, and it's just assumed that people are making these long trips, these pilgrimages, and back in the day, you didn't come into a place, get a hotel room, stay a couple nights, and then go home. You were there for a month or something like that. And so the original rule was you had to cross the threshold of St. Peter's Basilica 15 times while you were in Rome to get the indulgence, to make it official. Um, but the good news is, if you died on the way, it still counted. So if you
Yeah.
and so originally the idea was that when it was originally conceived, there would be a Jubilee year every 100 years. But that immediately didn't stick because, well, if you think about it, most people would never even be alive during a Jubilee year if it only happened once every 100 years.
Right.
So so they ended up doing the next one 50 years later, but actually in that time, the first one was 1300. In 1309, the French Pope moved the office of the papacy out of Rome and out of Italy and into France, and so we have that whole period of time when the papacy is in Avignon in France. Um, and so the next several jubilees are all at the different stages of them trying to get it back to Rome. So
Oh,
1350
okay.
and 1390, papacy came back in 1377, um, and then in 1400, and then again weirdly in 1423, the Pope decided that he was going to have a jubilee 33 years after the one in 1390 for Jesus's. Supposedly Jesus was 33 years old, which
Right.
technically is not true, but anyway, that's the tradition. And so I think it was in 1423 when they started with the Holy Doors, and by this time they had added St. John Lateran, the Cathedral of Rome, as the third basilica that you could visit while to get an indulgence while on the pilgrimage. Eventually, later they would also add St. Mary Major, so that they have all four.
Hmm.
But the Holy Door, so the Holy Door, then the idea is to receive the indulgence, you're crossing the threshold of these basilicas where the Pope might say Mass. So they just went one step further and said, well, instead of just crossing the threshold, we're going to make a special door. And so today, to this day, all four of the papal basilicas have a door that is only opened during a Jubilee year. The rest of the time, it's not only closed, but traditionally bricked over
Oh.
and or plastered over, at least on one side. And then the old tradition was the the Pope would ceremonially like hit the bricks with a hammer, and then they'd pull away the bricks and open the door. I don't think they go through the whole brick thing anymore, but um,
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there is a holy door on each of the four papal basilicas. Of course, St. Peter's is the primary, but St. John Lateran is actually the cathedral of Rome. And then there's St. Paul's and St. Mary's, St. Mary Major. Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. So, um, I know this is going to come up, obviously. So we're talking about um, going to these different sites, and it's almost like crossing the threshold in each one of these or whatever location it was historically. It almost seems like a little microcosm of almost stepping over the veil where it's most thin, and you're getting a sense of that as well. So I think there might be something mystically there.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. And, you know, well, it's also a microcosm of the whole Christian life, right? Because your Christian life is a journey. The destination is eternity in the kingdom of God. Um, but until you get there, you're on this journey, and it's a journey in which you're in a foreign land. Like, we live in the world, but we're not really citizens of the world, right? And so, in the same way, you go on pilgrimage, you go to a foreign country where you're not at home. It's not your land, and you're out of place there. And so it's sort of a, you know, like a metaphor for the Christian life in a way. But this idea of being on holy ground, it really is an affirmation that our faith is not a disembodied faith. Our faith is not a spirit only faith or a mind only faith, but it really affirms the fact that God mediates grace through the material world and through physical things. And obviously we have our sacraments and our sacramentals, and primary among them is probably the Eucharist, with the real presence of the body and blood under that veil of actual, physical elements of bread and wine, right?
Yeah.
God does mediate grace through the physical and the material, and and that's important. And so this idea of going on pilgrimage really is an entering into that, an affirmation of that.
Yeah, like you said, it's kind of bearing witness that our faith is incarnational. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
that's a,
thank you.
that's a
You
good
said it better
tie-in.
than I did, actually. Yeah.
Well, it was I like how you put it though. It's connected with the resurrection of the body and the incarnation. Just how matter is redeemed. You have definitely
Yeah.
have that at play here. Um,
Right, right. It's because the Gnostics would have said, matter is inherently evil, and therefore
right.
it's to be the human body is meant to be shed and discarded. And of course that led them to denigrate the human body in general and not take care of the poor and treat people like they were disposable, which is exactly what's going on in our culture now. But the point is yeah, so the human body and indeed, all creation is meant to be redeemed. And so this is this is a little way of entering into that. And to your point, stepping over the threshold is a, stepping into our hope of, you know
Hmm.
this redeemed and transformed existence.
Yeah. So there's a lot of depth here that I hadn't considered. I mean, I guess we could fall into the trap of when we look at the Jubilee and we look at the holy doors and the Holy Father opening each door and stepping through. Oh, if you visit these sites or sites designated in the U.S. or wherever, you get an indulgence. It seems kind of it could seem, or people could make it seem like a mechanical type process or
Yeah.
exchange, but really there's a lot of mystical and spiritual weight to this. I think it's important to recover that and not
Yeah.
lose sight of that, right?
Right, right. And I mean, even backing up a step, I mean, um, part of the part of the Protestant uh, let's say, discomfort with a lot of this is based on a misunderstanding, I think, that somehow we're earning our salvation, or we're paying for our own sins by doing penance and receiving these indulgences. But of course, that's not really what's going on here. I mean, you know, Jesus Christ paid for our sins, and that job is done. But what we're doing is, by doing penance, we're we're purifying our souls of sort of the residual effects of sin, and we're making some sort of reparation for the ripple effect of sin in the world. And so it's a little bit like, you know how in the Old Testament, if certain circumstances could make you unclean, right? So if you have to touch a dead body, you're unclean. What does that mean? It means you're impure, you're unfit to approach God in worship, and so you have to purify yourself with a ritual bath and all of this. Well, it's a little bit like that when we think of dying and going to heaven. Well, we're going to enter the heavenly realm and be in the presence of God. You can't do that if there's any impurities remaining on you. And so penance is the thing we do to purify ourselves. The only thing is, you can't possibly completely purify yourself in this life, so the purification process is completed after our death, and this is what we usually call purgatory. Bottom line is, the more penance you do in your life, the less purification you need after your life in purgatory. And so these indulgences are just ways for us to do penance, to purify ourselves, to move ourselves farther along in that process of sanctification towards entire sanctification, which, again, probably won't be completed until after we die. But the point is that, it's not simply step over the threshold, right? There's a process to it, and God knows how sincere you are, and God knows how repentant you are or not. And it also requires, I mean, if you're going to do this, you'd want to look it up, but it requires you to actually go to mass while you're there. And it requires you to go to confession before you go to mass. And it requires you to pray certain prayers, while you're there. And that's all part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, because inevitably it's going to come up. Well, why are we doing this to begin with? I mean, beyond the fact that it's a spirit, it's good for the soul. It's a spiritual exercise. It teaches us discipline, and again, it kind of reinforces the theme of exile and return, to and from the promised land. Oh, sorry, my daughter's just in here.
Family sounds.
Yeah, okay, she's gone now. Yeah, so we've got all those themes and those realities that are in the back of our mind, but inevitably it's going to come up. Well, what is an indulgence? First of all, why do we have them? How would you describe an indulgence if you were talking to, like, say, a Protestant who doesn't have a lot of background in this? How would you frame that for them?
Yeah, well, I have to do this often with my students, and the first thing you have to say is, for Protestants, indulgences are famous because Martin Luther and his crowd were criticizing the sale of indulgences, and to be fair, that is a problem. Although what we need to be clear about is that the popes never endorsed the sale of indulgence. And also, it's a myth that the money from the sale of indulgences paid for the building of St. Peter's. That's not true either. The money from the sale of indulgences, which was mostly going on in Germany, went to the German barons. It went to the German aristocracy. And it went for people to buy ecclesiastical offices. So it's all tied up with the sin of simony, wow, which is the buying of ecclesiastical offices. So the thing is, we don't sell indulgences anymore, but we do still have them. And an indulgence is, and I mean, technically, there's such a thing as a plenary indulgence, which is full pardon, and a partial indulgence, which is partial pardon. But an indulgence is really just simply the church's acknowledgement that penance has been done, and that the church is affirming that it affects us toward our purification. And so I think that's kind of the simplest way I would, I would explain it. It's the church's endorsement of penance that we do as a part of this process of sanctification for our own purification. And so, it's been simplified in our lifetimes. I mean, it used to be a very complicated system based on time off in purgatory. And I love, Pope Benedict XVI actually said some very important things about purgatory. And he, I think, rightly so, moved us away from thinking in terms of counting months and years and centuries in purgatory. And because he reminded us, look, purgatory is outside of time. So it's not helpful actually to think of it in terms of, length of time. But, back in the Middle Ages, they did. They had a spreadsheet for what kind of penances, reduced your time in purgatory by how many years or whatever.
Right.
And we've
Right.
kind of gotten away from that, and indulgences have been simplified. But there is actually, you can buy it. I mean, I have a copy. It's called the Handbook of Indulgences. It's very simple. It's only like that thick, and it
Mhm.
explains the indulgences and what indulgences are available to you um, to do. And there are partial indulgences for things as simple as praying the rosary. Um, and all that is really not to make a legalistic system out of it, but simply to say that, these are things we do as a part of the practice of our faith that contribute to our own sanctification, that purify us and purify us from. And I like what in the chat there, glory to Lord God says the temporal effects. Exactly. Purify us from the temporal effects of our sin.
Yeah, so I think we talked about this before in one of our episodes, and it was really helpful because I wasn't aware of this. But so you might be thinking, like, where did we get this idea of doing X penance gets you X time off in purgatory? Like, why even why even think of it in terms of accounting and that kind of thing? Like, where did we get this number system from? I'm sure we didn't pull it just arbitrarily out of nowhere. It had to come from somewhere. So if I remember correctly, Jim, you were saying that it was sort of analogous to when you committed certain sins in the early church, you had to do penance for X number of days, months, or years. So we kind of had that in the back of our mind when we were formulating these, these numbers and these times. It has something to do with like penance and sin in the early church and how penance. Well, I don't want to say was calculated, but for certain types of sins, you probably had to do certain types of penance for a certain length of time before you could be admitted back to communion, right? So I'm sure there's some of that
Yeah.
going on in the background.
There probably is. I mean, yeah, you're right. In the early church, penance was not so much a thing you do as it is the amount of time you do it. So, for example, like if you go to confession today and say, well, I'm here to confess this or that thing, the priest might say, all right, pray a decade of the rosary or pray a rosary. That's like a thing you do. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But in the early church, it was more like as if the priest were saying, you know, pray a rosary a day for the next 6 months.
Mm,
Then you can come back to communion. And the point being is you're not getting communion during the time you're doing penance.
right.
Or, or the penance would be, depending on how serious the sin was. And of course, in the early church, you had these occasions where people would deny the faith, deny Christ in order to save their lives. If you did something like that, you might be told, well, your penance is for the next year, 5 years, the next 7 years, you're going to stay in the back of the church and kneel while everyone else gets their communion, right? So it was a matter of time.
Mm.
And honestly, I don't know how it got from that to calculating time in purgatory. We'd have to get a real medievalist in here to tell us that. But I do know that the Middle Ages is when credit really developed, and this idea of money on paper. Now, the Romans had IOUs and things like this,
Hmm.
but the Middle Ages is really where we develop a credit economy, and I really do think that gets applied here. And we have one of our important medieval scholastics, Saint Anselm of Canterbury, who who correctly talked about sin as a debt. We owe God a debt of honor and worship and obedience, and when we fail to pay that debt, well, then we're in debt to God, and so sin puts us farther in debt. And it's like, I mean, I don't have to tell you this, but if you only pay the minimum payment on your credit card, you're never going to get out of debt, right?
Right.
Well, so that's the situation we're in, right? Because no good works we could ever do would be any more than paying the minimum payment. So we're never going to get out of debt. And so this is why we need we need the intercession of the saints, and we need purgatory, basically. So anyway, I think somewhere in this combination of the early Christian idea of penance as doing time, and
Yeah.
then the whole credit thing, I think that's where it came in. And
So probably a mixed bag of ingredients there.
yeah, and so I think Pope Benedict XVI was really right to kind of dial back that emphasis on time. You
Yeah.
know.
I do want to give a shout out to my friend Moses the Black, who said, stopping by to show your page some love. Love the content. Thank you, brother. I appreciate that. Um, my friend Moses the Black is an Eastern Orthodox Christian. He's got great content as well. So if you'd like to check out his page and subscribe, that would be awesome.
Sounds great.
So yeah, very, very interesting. So, because I think there would be a tendency to see, oh, it's just the medieval credit system, but I think that doesn't tell the whole story. Like a lot of things in, church history, it's kind of complicated, and Catholicism's not really an either or dichotomous thing. It's a both and. So there can be many layers to something. They could all be true to an extent at the same time. So I would probably, like I said, I'm not an expert, but I would venture to guess that it's probably a combination of the historical circumstance of the credit system and that foundation of penance equating to time in the early church. And that's probably all kind of snowballed together. I would think that makes the most sense to me anyway.
Yeah, and I think, like, again, as Pope Benedict said, we really need to focus on the purification aspect of it as opposed to the time aspect.
Right.
And bottom line is, most of us, unless we're bona fide saints, most of us will not be entirely sanctified at the end of our lives, and so we're going to need to go through that purification that we usually call purgatory, whatever that means. Um, but the more you can do during your life to purify yourself, the better. And that's the bottom line.
Yeah, and speaking of Pope Benedict on this subject of purgatory, in his encyclical Spe Salvi, he does speculate, and I think there's grounds for calling this more than mere speculation. I think there's a lot of good theological acumen here to back it up, but he did say that the fire of purgatory, rather than being this external sort of thing that's inflicted upon you, it's an encounter with Christ himself, who is a consuming fire. So I like the way the Easterners often frame it, because they said, well, we don't believe in purgatory. That's fine. You don't have to call it that. It is a post-mortem purification process. Whether we choose to call it something or not, that's the reality. But I do like how they frame it, and that is God is a consuming fire. He is love. He doesn't change. His disposition toward us doesn't change because he's immutable, unchanging, right? So, um, and he's impassible. He doesn't have love one moment and the next minute gets angry and wrathful. He's pure love, unchanging. So the only thing that changes is our disposition toward him. So if we have a saint, for example, or a saint in the making who's encountering the brightness of the glory of the Lord, to them, it might be warmth and, you know, joy and bliss. But for those who die outside of a state of grace, they would encounter the fire of God's love as something unpleasant because they've turned away, and this is the separation that they have to endure for all eternity, not because of what God has done to them, but what they have done in terms of their relationship to God and have walked away. So the fire of God's love is constant, but what changes is our disposition toward that fiery love, either bliss or pain, depending on our disposition. And purgatory being an encounter with Christ who purifies us. I think he said at the moment of our, it seems like a moment, I would imagine, but purifies us at the moment of death. That's because we encounter the purifying fire of Christ that burns away the dross and the sin and the effects of sin and all of that. I like the way that he framed that.
Yeah, I think that I think it's he who says though we don't want to focus on time or speculate on amounts of time, it's probably not instantaneous. Whatever, so this purification of purgatory is probably not instantaneous. And in fact, there is a long tradition of praying for the souls in purgatory.
Right.
And so I wouldn't want to minimize that. I find it really interesting, that fire as a symbol, metaphor, or whatever in scripture has two different meanings. It can mean destruction or it can mean purification. And you kind of alluded to this, but I love those images in the Old Testament of the purifying fire of the crucible,
Yeah.
um, the precious metal put in the crucible, and the fire melts it, and that's how it's purified. That's how the impurities rise to the top and are skimmed off, or whatever it is. And um, so that positive sense of the purifying crucible is what purgatory is. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of misspoke there. I shouldn't have said, and I didn't mean to say that it's instantaneous. In fact, for some people it probably will be, depending on how close to sainthood they are at the moment of death. But for others, it may seem like, not to be
Yeah.
cliche, but eternity. Uh, and hopefully
Yeah.
that's not my situation. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Well, and
obviously,
this is why the sacrament of confession is important too, because most people, and probably myself included, don't go to confession often enough, and you know uh, that is there for the same reason, for that ongoing purification. Yeah.
right. Uh, Rick in the comments says, I'm doing a bike pilgrimage this summer to Mary's Shrine in Ontario, Canada. It will be a 170-kilometer ride. Pray for my success. Wow. I don't know. Like, I don't know what the conversion is to miles for you guys, but that's long. That's a long ride.
Yeah. Well, but that brings up a great point. Rick, I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
Not everyone can go to Rome or Italy, right? And so pilgrimage doesn't have to be that kind of big trip to Italy or the Holy Land. There are shrines and pilgrimage sites everywhere. And I know you guys are in Canada. I don't know Canada as well, but in virtually every state in the US, there is some place that you can go within a car ride, road trip, distance, where you could make a pilgrimage to some shrine or something like that. And so, you know, this is Jubilee year. If you can't get to Rome, well, it's going to be pretty crowded in Rome. But think about where you can go, because again, a pilgrimage is really, a way to sort of reboot your faith and your relationship with God, and get a fresh start. And it's that prodigal coming home, and it's also kind of like that concept of the hero's journey. If you know about this concept, it comes up in storytelling, and it's in all of our folk stories, and it's in all of the classic mythology. And it's this idea that there are certain archetypes in all of these stories, but one of the archetypal characters is, of course, the hero, the protagonist. And in all of this, the hero's journey stories, and if you've never heard of this before, see if this sounds familiar. Something happens, there's an inciting incident that forces the hero to leave the ordinary world and enter a special world where they go on a journey of self-discovery, and they have to overcome adversity and obstacles, and they have to arrive at a destination. And when they arrive there, they have to get something and bring it back home. And when they come back home, they either share it with their friends, or it changes their life and they're never the same again. Right? That's the hero's journey, and we see it in all of these stories. And yet there's a reason why that kind of idea is hardwired into the human psyche, and it comes up in every culture and in all these stories. It's because there's just something about that. And so a pilgrimage is like that. Like, you go on a pilgrimage, you're the hero who has to leave your ordinary world for a while in order to come back changed and bring something back with you that will make your ordinary world newer, different, better than it was before. That whole idea, I think, is just is really significant for humans. And even if you're not the kind of person that likes to travel, or is able to travel, this idea of getting out of your comfort zone for a little while, this thing is really important. 105 miles. I'll tell you what, I
Ooh,
once did a bike tour in Ireland, and halfway through, they all made fun of me because halfway through on the free day, like 3 days on the bike, then we had a day off in Dingle, and then 3 days. I literally spent that day tracking down a bike shop and bought a big cushy seat, like with this much cushion on it, because I just could not even get on that seat another day without
wow.
that.
Oh man, I can't imagine. Yeah,
So
105 miles, Rick. Good on you, man. I really admire that. And
yeah,
again, like that's something that that trip that you're undergoing, that journey, again, the beauty of our faith, any undertaking that we perform, we can offer for various intentions, and God uses that to give people, grace, healing, salvation, whatever it is. So something like that you could offer for the souls in purgatory, and you might, and again, not to be too legalistic about it, but you might, however this looks, you might get thousands of souls out of purgatory, or speed up the process. And of course, these are just analogous statements. Obviously, we don't know to what extent these are literal or whatever, but that's the idea, right? Is we can truly help people on their journey of sanctification. We're all connected. We're all part of the body of Christ. So the members can distribute graces amongst each other, of course, all from the fountainhead, who is Jesus Christ. But it's just a testament to how interconnected we are and how united we are in Jesus Christ. It's a very powerful testament to that, I think.
yeah, yeah. And it gets back to the whole concept that a pilgrimage is supposed to be a hardship. It's supposed to be a penance. And I'll be the first to admit, most of my pilgrimages are not that difficult. I get on an airplane, I get in a taxi, although we do walk a lot. But yeah, so but even just the hardship of being in a place with a language barrier and everything else. Um so Rick, for you, the work of your pilgrimage will be pedaling that bike for 100 miles.
Oh man, yeah, you guys, amazing. I wish I could do stuff like that. Unfortunately, with my disability, that's not really a possibility. But I'd have to think of something else to do. Something I have to find something as heroic. Might not be a physical undertaking, but 8 hours of me and the Holy Spirit. Yeah. God bless you
Yeah,
too,
right.
brother. Uh,
But
that's really cool.
that's a good point. I mean, every not everybody's work of a pilgrimage is going to be the same kind of work, but the point is that you're setting aside the distractions of everyday life. You're doing a thing for a chunk of time that gets you out of the routine and the distractions and the all the little annoyances. I mean, there'll be other annoyances, but you know,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So, uh, you were telling me you were talking to Mike on the podcast recently. Um, so you guys are doing a pilgrimage to Sicily. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So, and Haley uh, made reference to it in the chat. Yeah. So, Mike Aquilina and I are co-leading a pilgrimage to Sicily in December. Of course, like everyone else, we talked about doing a pilgrimage together, and we said, well, Jubilee year, so we were talking about we're going to do this pilgrimage to Rome in this year. And in the end, though, there are plenty of other opportunities to do Rome. I mean, everybody's doing Rome this year, which as they should. But we ended up deciding to do something else and go somewhere else. So we're doing Sicily, and we're doing um, this is December 1st through the 11th, and maybe I don't know, maybe we can put a link in the show description or something.
Sure.
But if anybody's interested, but it's December 1st through the 11th in Sicily. We're going to see pilgrimage sites in Sicily. There's a couple of martyr saints whose tombs are in Sicily. There are other, historic Catholic sites in Sicily. And we may also make a stop in the places where The Godfather was filmed in Sicily. So it'll be Fathers of the Church slash Godfathers
Godfathers. Yeah.
pilgrimage to Sicily, and so we're looking forward to that. So if anyone wants to join us, I'm pretty sure there's spots available on that as well. So yeah,
Oh, that's so cool. And that's a place I wouldn't normally associate with. I know Catholic equals Italian in a lot of contexts. I mean, that goes without saying, right?
yeah,
But Sicily in particular, I don't really associate anything uh, too significant with Sicily other than food. But I
yeah.
never.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. But I'll tell you, it's very interesting because southern Italy and Sicily were you know, uh, inhabited by a lot of Greek immigrants back in the day, especially in the aftermath or during the icon controversy. So you had this situation where the emperor in Constantinople and some of the leadership there were trying to outlaw icons. Of course, the Pope was in favor of the use of icons, and so this became this big controversy and this big battle. And I mean, there was violence, and it was a huge deal. And so a lot of people left the East and moved to Italy. And so then now you have all these Greeks living in Italy. And so, I mean, if you look at my name, you might think, oh, he must be Greek. I'm sure 1,000 years ago, my last name had an S on the end of it or an OU on the end of it, and my
Right.
my ancestors came from Greece, right? Of course, now it's all Italian, but yeah. So Sicily is, believe it or not, this really beautiful um, combination of East and West,
Wow.
and several of the popes came from Sicily. They were Greeks, but they were from Sicily, and they became popes. So we're going to explore all of this stuff, but it's just this really beautiful overlap between East and West, um, and of course, yeah. Then also when East and West split, any Easterners who had the means and were serious about staying in communion with Rome, they would have left and moved to Italy then too. So it's just this whole ongoing,
Oh.
immigration from Greece into Italy, and it's Sicily and Calabria where the Papandreas are from, and yeah. So
That's
Uh,
fascinating, Jim.
yeah.
I had no idea that there was an Eastern connection to
Oh
Sicily, but
yeah. Yeah.
that's really interesting. And Ralph says in the chat, thanks for covering this, Ralph. Thank you for watching, brother. I appreciate that. If you wouldn't mind sharing this video, if you think it will garner some interest in your social media network and share information that might be new to a lot of people, then please consider sharing this video. I know I've certainly learned a lot, and that's just scratching the surface. But yeah, if anyone's interested, Jim and I actually did an episode on venerating icons and relics.
Yeah.
It was probably a couple of years ago now, I would say, maybe a year and a
Oh,
half
time
ago.
flies. I don't know, but it was during there was a big it I don't know if controversy is the right word, but I mean there was a moment in time when the internet was all abuzz with sort of Catholic Protestant debate and apologetics around this issue of icons, and so we had to set the record straight. So you're welcome.
Yes, and in all humility, I say that we did a pretty well. You did a fantastic job, and that was the whole controversy with Gavin Ortland and the early church
Right.
being against icons and all that. Uh, so what we ended up saying, and not to get too far afield, but just as we close out here, just a tidbit there. Um, we ended up saying, like, what was constant in the church was veneration of the saints, but icons or external media that underwent development and change. But what didn't change was the underlying reality, that is the veneration of saints and martyrs. So it might have started off with the relics of martyrs and
Yeah.
the remains of martyrs, or whatever, piece of their clothing or what have you. Eventually that transferred on to the veneration of icons. So the accidents, if you will, to use a Thomistic phrase, changed or developed, but the substance, i.e., the veneration of martyrs and saints, that's what is the underlying constant, which did not develop. So we can say, because the Second Council of Nicaea said this was the practice of the apostles. In that sense, in terms of substance, we can say yes, that's true, because
Yeah.
the Jews obviously venerated holy ones and decorated the tombs of the martyrs and the prophets. That's what Jesus said to the Pharisees that they were doing. That's obviously an act of veneration, and that carried over into the Christian church. Which we're
Yeah.
a continuation of temple Judaism. So all that's connected. Very
Yeah.
interesting episode. If you guys want to go back, just type in Jim Papandrea, Holy Smokes icons, or something like this, and it'll come
Yeah.
up.
Yeah, but I mean, it all goes back to this reality that the Christian faith is not it's not Gnostic. It's not a disembodied faith. It's an incarnational faith in which God mediates grace through material things, sometimes sacraments, but also sometimes what we might call sacramentals, or these other things that are not quite sacraments, but things like the relics of the martyrs and other saints and icons, and obviously, but to your point, it just tracks all the way through to the Old Testament, because all the way back to the snake on a pole.
Right.
So yeah, it's really interesting stuff, but it did lead to a lot of Greeks moving to Italy. So there you have it.
Wow. Yeah, see, and that's the thing. Everybody, and not this isn't a knock on our Eastern friends, but it's a historical reality that in the age of the first seven ecumenical councils, everybody looked to Rome as the beacon of orthodoxy. All the
Yeah.
Christological heresies, including iconoclasm, because that icons are everything to do with the incarnation and the redemption of matter, like we talked about. So all the Christological heresies began in the East, and everybody was looking not just to the West in general, but to Rome in particular as the bulwark of orthodoxy. So that's an
Yeah.
interesting,
I think that's
thing
true.
too.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely think that's true. And, you can even see it. So let's say if you were to make a pilgrimage in the early church, in the earliest days, like let's say the earliest, decades when Christianity was legalized, and the Emperor Constantine was starting to build churches, and he was starting to build um, the build up the monuments at the tombs of the martyrs. Well, if you would have gone there at that time, you would have seen a nice little martyr shrine at the tomb of St. Paul and a big basilica at the tomb of St. Peter. And so, even from the beginning there, you can see the priority given to Peter, and then and his successors were treated as his successors.
Right. Oh man, what an informative chat we've had, Jim, and it's gone by pretty quick, I have to say.
It
Unfortunately,
always does.
it
It
always
always
does.
does.
It always does, doesn't it? Well, this year,
Christine says her mother is from Palermiti, Calabria. Ah, yes.
Berry
Yes,
Creek.
I'm Calabrese. Yeah.
That's so cool. Yeah, unfortunately, we didn't get to link up this year when I went to Florida, but hopefully next time we'll be able
Yeah,
to
yeah.
hook up again. And
Hope so.
I've got Olive Garden salad dressing in my fridge, and whenever I take it out, I always think of us at the Olive Garden.
That's right. Well, we
And
are definitely going to have to reenact that family night out.
do a little pilgrimage.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
We're
Well,
a big group. It's hard to get a table between our two families.
well, yeah. That whole issue with the making the reservation three
Yeah,
times.
Olive
Yeah,
Garden doesn't take reservations,
yeah.
apparently.
You went a little Godfather on them that time. Inside jokes,
It's
guys.
like that
Inside jokes.
Seinfeld. It's like that Seinfeld
Right.
episode. You have no problem taking the reservation. You just can't keep the
You just can't
reservation.
keep it. Yeah, exactly. Oh man, good times.
All right.
Well,
And on that note,
yeah, we'll end it there, guys. But yeah, you've been tuned into Holy Smoke, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick. This was episode 129, Jubilee and Pilgrimage, with my good friend, Dr. Jim Papandrea. And with that, guys, we will say good night. Thank you so much for spending time with us on a Friday evening. And please enjoy your Lent. And, happy penance, happy fasting, and all that. We were talking a lot about penance tonight, and we are in the perfect season for that. So I pray that God accepts all your penances and your sacrifices united to Christ for the salvation of the world. Please pray for the repose of the souls of those who have died, those in purgatory, that they may enjoy the fullness of the beatific vision. I can only hope that when I go home to the Lord, people pray for me and offer up sacrifices for me, because Lord knows I'm going to need it. And like Jim said, the more penance we do on earth, the less we have to do post-mortem. So maybe that was a good reminder to me. I don't want to wait till the last minute. I want to get it all over with now, and I want to go straight to my destination, my pilgrimage destination with no pit stops, God willing.
that's right.
All right, guys. Well, we'll end it there, and y'all have a good weekend, and
Good
we'll talk to you
night.
soon.
Thanks
night.
for being here.
Thanks, Jim.
See you later.